So let's select simply the author here, and then let's overwrite that. So basically set it back to 0. Okay. So we have not selected this author class before. So let's just do that here. So the margin at the bottom should be 0. And then let's actually add a margin to the left here to create that space between the image. So margin left, 15 pixels. And here we go. Nice. Now let's just add some space between this new author box that we created and this element here. So I'm adding another margin left of 15 pixels, or actually margin bottom, of course. Okay, beautiful. And now it's actually finally time to style this one here a little bit better. So each of these li elements here are kind of a mess right now. Let's actually check out the markup, and we can do that here again, right here. So we have the li's, and all it does is to have an image and the A and the P in there. But what we really want is to have this anchor and this paragraph side by side with the image. So let me see. Yeah, so this here is what we want. So on one side the image, and on the other side some box, which then contains these two elements right here. So let's add some classes here to our markup so we can actually style it now finally. So this entire UL is called related. So let's give each of the LIs the class of related post. So copying all of this, and ideally we add these classes right in the beginning when we actually start writing our markup. All right, so we don't just do it later, because that is a bit more work. Because now we actually also should add some classes here to these hyperlinks. So the P's already have related author, so let's call this one here the related link. So class related link. And then add that to the other two. And there we go. Now going back here to our CSS, the flex container should probably be the related post, right? So related post, and set display to flex. And this is the one. But now we have the problem where all of the three are now flex items. So you see, this one and this one and this one are all flex items. And that is not what we want. So I think I mentioned that earlier, that we want these two here to be in the same box, so that that box can then be on the right side of the image. So I forgot to do that here, so let's do it now. So I'm just again wrapping it inside of a div. Then here I hit enter, and again I use option and arrow down to move it down and give it a save. And this one here doesn't really need any name. We really just need this box so that this box with this content can then be at the right side of this image. So again, the trick of moving down this div, so that closing tag and here the same. Well, I should at least spell it right, like this. And if we check it out now, then that finally looks right. Okay. And now we then need to also vertically align this once again. Let's actually make this smaller again so we can immediately see our results. So at this point, it should be easy to vertically align them, right? So align items center. All right, nice. But now once again, there is this problem that one of these elements, I guess, still has an old margin. So that is a problem that happens when we start writing code first with floats, for example, or just adding some random margins everywhere, and only later we start refining the code. So that's happening because we're still learning here, but in the future, all of this will become a bit easier. So don't worry that this is all a mess. So in this case, we still have this problem that by default, we assigned a margin bottom to the paragraphs. So let's get this related author here and remove that. So related author, and then let's say margin bottom and put it back to 0. And since we're here, let's actually also style this. So font size 14 pixels. And many of the things that we need to do here is to now kind of reset some of the things we did earlier. So for example, for some reason this is bold. So let's put it back to normal. So font weight should be normal. And now let's actually style all of these as italic. And let's wait for it. Yeah, that looks quite nice already. Let's quickly now style these links here actually. And then once we're done with that, we will add some spacing here. So let's do that here. So related link, and then never forget that we need to use the link pseudo class. All right. So let's say font size 17 pixels. There's a small bug. Then here the font weight should be bold, but the font style should be normal. So again, in the very beginning of the course, we wrote some style that made it so that this very first element is bold and the last one is italic. And so here we are just resetting that instead of going back all the way and fixing that code. Okay, so that looks a bit better. Let's just add some margin here to the bottom of this anchor. So margin bottom, let's say 5 pixels. And this is once again just to show you something, because this actually did not work. So it looks exactly the same. And can you guess why that is happening? Well, the reason is that the anchor, remember, is an inline element. And therefore, vertical spacing like margin bottom and margin top do not apply. So to fix that, let's simply display it as a block. And then this keeps jumping up. But anyway, now we get our nice space here, right? And now just to finish, let's add that gap here, so that spacing. So how could we do that? Well, there are 3 different ways, actually. So we could select this image here, then add some space to the right. We could select this box, which contains these 2. So this div here, and then add some space to the left. Or we could use that other property on the flex container that I showed you earlier, which is the gap property. And that is personally my absolute favorite. And so let's do that. So the related posts here, remember, is the flex container. And we can easily see that because that's the one who has display set to flex. And then let's add a gap of 20 pixels. And nice, there it is. The only problem with the gap property in Flexbox is that only the very latest versions of Safari actually support them. So on the Mac and on Safari, until a couple of weeks ago, gap was actually not supported. But now it is, and so we can maybe start using it, especially if you are watching this in the far future. Anyway, let's now also add some margin here to the bottom of 30 pixels to add some space between these. And we also then need to remove it from the last one. So as usual, all of them get this. Well, actually it doesn't. So this has the margin bottom, this and this doesn't. So I guess we already wrote some style which did this. So indeed, we somewhere selected all the list elements, and then the last child, we set margin bottom to 0. All right, and so that fixed it then for us here in this situation as well. Okay, and actually I think that's it for transforming the smaller parts of the page to Flexbox. So Flexbox is absolutely perfect for these small component layouts that we just built here. And we will not replace these with CSS GRID later. So instead we will use Flexbox and CSS GRID together when the time comes. But next we will finally build the same layout that we did before with floats, but with Flexbox. So stay tuned for that one. All right, so let's now use all our Flexbox knowledge in order to build the overall page layout using Flexbox. And actually, that shouldn't be too hard for us at this point, because the layout is actually quite simple. So let's now make this a bit bigger again. And so remember that the layout we are trying to achieve is simply this. So basically, the header and the footer are going to stay in place. So they are already perfect right now. And so all we need to do is to put this article side by side with the related posts. And these related posts, remember, should have a width of 300 pixels. And then we want a gap here in the middle of 75 pixels. Now, okay, so let's do that. And again, what we need to do is basically only put this element here side by side with this article. And so once again, the first question to ask is, what is going to be our flex container? So is it maybe the container element? So the element with the class of container? Well, let's go to the top of the page. Let's try that out. Display flex. And well, it doesn't look like that was the correct solution. So now everything here is kind of side by side, and that makes sense. So the reason for that is that all of these, so the header, the article, the aside, and the footer, all of them are actually children of this container. And so of course, this is not our flex container we are looking for. Instead, what we will have to do is to create a new one. So with Flexbox, many times it is necessary to create a new flex container in order to achieve our layouts. So remember in the last lecture, we actually had to do the same thing here for each related post. So we had to create a new div here so that this div could then be side by side with the image. So that's not the same situation actually, but we still had to create a new element in order to achieve our layout. So that's, again, quite common using Flexbox. But anyway, now we want to create a parent for both the article and the aside. So let's create a new div here. So again, an element without a real meaning. And this one, I'm going to call it just row. So a very generic name, which we could reuse all over the page if we wanted. So let's remove this one from here and paste it after the end of the aside. So here ends the article, then starts the aside, and then after the aside and before the footer is where we close the div, give it a save, and then it reformats everything. And so let's then go down here to the end of our code and start building the layout. So our row is now the flex container. And So this is what it looks like. And actually, that already looks pretty good, just like this. So without having to do a lot of work, actually. Now let's just inspect this aside, because it looks like it already has a width. But, well, actually it doesn't. So this is just a Flexbox automatic position, basically automatically trying to figure out the perfect width for this element. So apparently that's 281 pixels, but what we want it to be is 300 pixels. So just like we did before when we did it with floats, right? So let's specify the width of the aside. And now remember that for flex items, we should not use the width property, but instead use the flex basis. So that would be flex basis 300 pixels. Let's see if that works. And it doesn't seem to work, right? So it's still at 281. And the reason for that must be is that Flexbox like to automatically shrink these elements. So we need to set flex shrink to 0. Remember that. And we should actually do all of that in the shorthand flex property anyway. So just flex. And then the first one, remember, is flex grow. And let's check that out here. And actually, I will copy it here because this can be a source of confusion. Okay. So just formatting it here quickly to make it look a bit better. And so here the default of flex grow is 0, and we want to keep that. And the default of flex shrink is 1, but let's set that also to 0 to force it to be exactly 300 pixels wide. And so maybe you saw that it grew, and indeed now we have our 300 pixels. All right. And now let's actually format the article as well. So that's this other column basically. And for now, let's do it in a similar way. So setting these to 0 and then specifying exactly 825 pixels, just like we did before. So that's going to be 825 plus a 75 pixels of space between them, and then plus the 300 pixels right here. So let's do it like this for now, but we will change that a bit later. Okay. And now let's add that gap here in between. So that's space. And so for that, on the flex container, remember, we can use the gap property. So let's set that to 75 pixel, just like before. And so now our layout is basically done. Let's check that out. So 300 pixels, and this one has our 825 pixels. And so everything added together gives us our 1200 pixels, which is the width of the container. Now having to do all this math kind of defeats the purpose of using Flexbox in the first place. And so maybe we just want the aside to be really this size, but then the article, maybe we can allow Flexbox to automatically figure out its size, right? So usually what we do in a situation like this is to simply set flex to 1, which will then automatically allow this element to grow as much as it can in the available space. And so if we give this a save, then our element should actually look exactly the same as before. And indeed, it does. So it's still 825 pixels wide because that is simply the space that is available for it. And so, well, that's then exactly the space that it can fill. Okay, now let's just figure out what happens down here. And maybe you have noticed that this aside here grew all the way to the bottom. So we will take a look at why that happens, but you also see that it actually grew a bit more. So almost here to the end. And the reason for that is that this article has some margin here, which we also added way back. And so one more time, this margin is kind of part of the size of this element. And so let's now actually remove that here. So margin bottom 0. Okay. And instead, to create some space here between the footer and this content, let's add that margin bottom to the entire row. So to this container, right? But what matters is that now this is at least kind of aligned to this one, right? So margin bottom of 60 pixels. Nice. And now let's think why actually this element grew all the way until the bottom here. So can you think why that is happening? Well, the reason is that remember how the default value for align items is stretch. So basically, if we don't define align items, then automatically all the elements will stretch as far as they can. And in this case, the largest element is this aside here, or actually this article, which we can see if we add a color to it. So background color red. So you see that this element, of course, is way larger. And so then by default, all other flex items grow as much as they can in order to have the same size. So you see they're perfectly aligned here at the bottom. Now, many times, this is exactly the behavior that we want. And before Flexbox, with just float layouts, this kind of layout was actually almost impossible to achieve with CSS alone. But now, as you see, it's very easy. It even happens by default, right? Now, in the situation, let's say we don't want that, and so let's fix it. So how do we fix it? Well, we simply set the align items property on the parent to something else. So on the flex container here, let's say align items and then set it to flex start. And yeah, so now it's back to only occupying vertically the space that is necessary without growing as much as it can. Great. That's amazing. So with this, we finished applying Flexbox to our project. And in this lecture in particular, we used almost all of the things that we had already learned about Flexbox. So that's amazing, and that's great progress if you're still sticking with me here at this point. And remember that Flexbox is a lot of stuff to take in, and personally, it took me a lot of time to actually learn all of it. So it's really not a problem if in your head things are still confusing at this point. All you need to do is to now start practicing Flexbox on your own. That is really key to make the material stick in your head. And the first opportunity for that is actually the coding challenge that is coming up in the next lecture. So hopefully I see you there as soon as you can. Time to practice your new Flexbox skills in coding challenge number 2 of this section. And once again, here I already have the code from the last challenge, which we will use as a starting point for this one. And also, as always, you can find a link to this code somewhere in this lecture. All right. So what we're going to do now is to basically replace floats and do everything with Flexbox. So what I want you to do is to use Flexbox here in this situation. Also, you can actually now use Flexbox here. So before we were using the trick of using display as inline block, but let's actually now change that to Flexbox so that you can practice a bit more. And then finally, I want you to build this entire layout here. So these 3 elements, putting them side by side using Flexbox once again. And in this case, I actually don't want you to specify the width or the flex spaces of, let's see what it is. So 243. So remember that? So again, right now, I don't want you to specify the width or the flex spaces of these two columns here manually. Instead, you should simply allow Flexbox to figure out the width of these two columns. Okay? So given everything that you have learned over the last couple of videos, I hope that you can have some fun solving this one. And so once you're done with that, I see you back here. Welcome back, and I hope that you completed this challenge successfully. And so here is how I would have done it. So starting here with this price and the free shipping label, as always, the first question is, what element should be the flex container? Well, let's see in our markup here. So here is the price and the shipping. And right now, I think we don't have any suitable flex container, right? Because we only want these two elements here to be flex items, but they do have a lot of siblings that are also in this same div element here, so in the same container. And so what we need to do is to wrap these two into a new container element. So div class, and let's call this one here the product price. Okay, and then after these two, we will close this. Okay, let's copy our class name here, and then let's use that right here. So first of all, let's undo the floating stuff here. And this one as well, and also this margin top that we manually set. Now we no longer need to do that, right? And then also we had a clear somewhere. Yeah, right here. So this one we also no longer need. And now this should be quite simple. So product price, which is the element that contains these two here, should now become our flex container. So display flex, and immediately they are now side by side. Then we want to push each of them to one of the sides, right? And so for that, we can use that trick that we also used for the heading and the navigation in our website header. And so that was to use justify content and then space between. And there we go. And now finally, we need to also vertically align these two because we removed those 8 pixels that we had. And so now, again, let's do that automatically using align items set to center. Well, something looks strange here. Let's inspect that. Maybe there is some padding or margin. Yeah, indeed it is. So here the shipping does have some margin at the bottom. And so if we were to remove that, then it would look normal, right? So now you see here it makes sense. And so let's remove that from our code and put it maybe on this flex container. So yeah, so right here, let's remove that from here. And put that right here. Okay, beautiful. So now it makes more sense. And usually we don't run into this kind of problem because usually we simply code from scratch and don't have to deal with the code that we wrote before at some point. All right, now let's use Flexbox on these, which should be even simpler. So let's see. So right here, color. So color is actually, I think, each of these 6 elements. And so the flex container should be the parent of those. So let's see what we have here. Here we have colors. And let's actually call them product colors. So just like all the other elements. So we have product price, product description. Let's call these product colors. Let's grab that here. And so to start, let's actually remove this right here. So they are back to being block elements and therefore occupying an entire line. But now we set the parent to flex, and so these are now flex items and they are side by side. All right. Also, we can improve this even more because now we can remove this margin right from each of the elements and instead use the gap property. So with that, we then have the definition of how the layout looks like all in the flex container, which makes our code a bit easier to reason about. So 10 pixels, and there we go. Great. Now all we have to do is to apply Flexbox also to this layout. So the layout of these 3 columns. So right now, each of them has a certain width that we manually defined, and it has float. Well, let's just turn this off by using Command or Control/. Then here I will remove the float, and the same in this other container, which is called product details. Let's remove all of that here. And so now it looks, of course, very weird, and we still have a float on the image. So let's remove that as well. Yes, right here. And so now we lost basically all layout that we had, but it is of course easy to put that back. So remember that we created in the last lecture, or actually in the last challenge, we created this container element, right? And it is this container here which contains both the image and the product info column. So this here, and also the product details. And so this makes sense to be our flex container, right? So display flex, and there we go. So now these elements are back to being side by side, and all we need to do now is to give these two an equal width. So again, before we did that manually by defining this value here, but now since we're using Flexbox, let's do it in a better way. And what I'm talking about is to specify flex and set it to 1 on this one. So basically it grows as much as it can, but this only makes sense once we add the same to the other, so the product details. So let's do that. So again, flex 1, and now since they have the same value, they should be the exact same size. And it looks like they are. Let's inspect that. And so we have the product info, 243.5, and this one also 243.5. So exactly the same, all thanks to the power of Flexbox. So without us having to go in and manually calculate these width here, which remember was kind of complicated and a lot of unnecessary work. All right. So this is actually already finished now, but let's make it even better. So right now we are defining these spaces here. So this one, basically in this one, using margins. And we are doing that by setting margin right on the product info and margin right on the product image. But what if at some point we wanted to change that? Then we would have to go search for these properties in all the elements and change them one by one. So that's never a good thing to do. And so we can actually remove these from here. So no more margin right. And the same here. And we can then specify this gap, so these 40 pixels, right on the flex container. So that's right here, using the gap property once again. And so this is really a lot cleaner and a lot nicer and a lot easier for us to work with. Now somehow this looks different. So let's inspect once again here. So this column looks smaller somehow. So let's inspect. And indeed, it has 2, 2, 3, and this one is also now smaller. So let's see what happens here. And one nice trick we can use in the dev tools to figure out what's going on with Flexbox is to hover the Flexbox container. And we can even click here, and it will then give us this nice overlay with the gaps and also with our entire Flex container and Flex items. Now, what I'm seeing here is that it created an additional gap here at the end where it is not supposed to be. Now, I'm seeing that this is happening because there is this pseudo element here in the end. And so therefore Flexbox sees this as an actual element and therefore adds another gap, even though in the end, usually we don't want it. But again, right now it is as if this pseudo element here was actually the last element. And so therefore Flexbox created another gap between these two. So that actually comes again because of some older legacy code, which is this clear fix here. So remember that this clear fix introduces a pseudo element. So we don't want that. And yeah, so now that's fixed. We are back to normal. And so with that, we are finished with this challenge. And actually, we are also finished with this introductory part to Flexbox. So moving on, we will start talking about CSS GRID. But before you go there, please make sure that you really understood Flexbox, or at least these properties that I showed you in these couple of lectures. So if you're still really confused about Flexbox, you should not move on to CSS GRID, because then you will get even more confused, because they are a bit similar in a way. So this will confuse you a lot if you don't have the fundamentals of Flexbox down yet. So if that is the case, then please try to come up with some own projects and write some code on your own to keep practicing these concepts. I really can't stress enough how important it is to not just move on without fully understanding these fundamentals of Flexbox. Okay, so I hope that made sense. And then once you are actually ready for your next step, then let's move on to the CSS GRID part of this section. So I hope you're excited to start learning about CSS GRID. I am for sure, and I actually can't wait to finally show you CSS GRID. And to start learning CSS GRID, the best thing is to once again do that in isolation. So just like we did here with Flexbox, which we no longer need, we also have a starter file for CSS GRID. So this HTML file right here is what we will start using to learn CSS GRID now. And again, we already connected that file here in our navigation of our main page. So here we have cssgrid.html. So if we go here to our page and click that, then here is our starter file. So you see, actually, we have two container elements here. So let me show that to you. Yeah. So we have container 1 and container 2. And the first one is this one here. So basically with the same 8 HTML elements that we had before. Okay, so don't worry about this one here for now. Let's actually turn this one off for now. And to do that, we can do something that we haven't done before. So let me show you something new. And that is display. And we can set it to none. And with this, it will simply be completely removed from the page. All right. But anyway, let's now get started with CSS GRID here in this container 1. So CSS GRID is right now the most modern way of building layouts, and it's also the most complete one, and in my opinion, it is even the easiest way of building layouts, at least if you use only the fundamentals. And setting up a simple grid takes less than a minute, so let's quickly do that. Now, just like in Flexbox, we have flex containers and flex items, in CSS GRID, we have a grid container and then grid items. So it's a very similar logic, and so our grid container is of course going to be this one here. And so in order to declare that here in our code, we can write display, and now it's not flex, but grid. All right, and that's actually it. So visually, this changes nothing in this case, because now we need to actually define our two-dimensional layout. So basically our columns and our rows. So let's do that. So we use the property called grid template columns. And now here we can define as many width values as we want. And then for each of these values, one column will be created. So let's say we write 250 pixels and 150 pixels. So just these two values. And so this code will generate two columns, one with a width of 250 pixels and another one with a width of 150. So let's save this. And indeed, there we go. So we have indeed now two columns. And if we inspect this, we can see, of course, that the width are just what we specified there. We need some more space here. So indeed, this one has 150 and this one has 250. And in CSS GRID, if we turn on this visualization, we can actually see a lot of different stuff, but more about that later. So as soon as we start creating some columns, then all the elements will be displayed in columns and rows. And so as many rows will be created as necessary. So let's add some more columns here. Why not? So let's say that we wanted a 4x2 grid. So a grid with 4 columns and 2 lines. So let's add another one here. And then another one. Let's say this one has only 150. And well, now there's not enough space. So let's, just like before, remove this one here a little bit. And then maybe we can change this to just 200. Let's see. Let's decrease this a little bit more. And maybe these can be just 100. And so then this makes everything a bit easier to see. But anyway, what's important to understand here is that these grid items were now placed in these 4 columns, and then as many rows as necessary are created to accommodate for all the content. So if we had another element here, let's say like this, then of course a new row would be created and the new item would be placed there, and the rest here would simply be left empty. But for now, just for this demo, let's leave it like this. And let's notice something else here, which is that just like in Flexbox, the elements stretch across the entire cell. So basically across the height and the width that we defined for each cell. So each of these areas here between the columns and the rows. And a bit more about these terms actually in the next lecture. But what I was saying is that since this element here has a height of 150, so this green one, then this entire row will have that height. So in order to accommodate for that height, and all of these elements will then stretch as far as they need to basically fill that entire row. So if this did not exist, then the row would simply be the height of this content, which is the reason why this row is in fact only as tall as this cell here, so as this grid item. Okay, so that is at least the default behavior, but of course we can also size these rows to make them as tall as we want. So we can size the columns like this, and so of course we can also size the rows. So grid, template, and then, as you might have guessed, rows. And let's say we want the first one to be 300 pixels tall and the second 200 pixel. So the idea is the same as with the columns. So the first row will get this one, the second one will get this height. And so if we save this, this is what it looks like. And now this grid item here, which has that defined height of 150, does not stretch across this entire cell here, while these other grid items fill the entire cell, as we can see here with these colors. Okay, so this is how you create a simple grid. So actually all you need would be the columns, and if you then want to also define the rows, you can do that by giving them an explicit height. Okay, now just to finish this lecture, just like in Flexbox, we can also specify a gap in CSS GRID. And actually, this is the only way of defining space between the grid items. So always use gap and never margins. That is simply not going to work. So we can use gap, and this property actually used to be called grid gap, but they dropped that grid prefix when they also added gap to Flexbox. So now it is simply called gap, but if you for some reason see this somewhere, then just know that this is exactly the same, and it will also work in browsers. But anyway, let's define now a gap, let's say 30 pixels, and this will do exactly what we expect. So it creates some gap between these elements, both between the columns and the rows. Now, what we cannot do in Flexbox, but can do in Grid, is to actually define separate values for the column and for the rows. So let's do that. So we can say the column gap should still be 30. So let's remove this one. And then the row gap should be, let's say, double. So 60 pixels. And so if we give this a space now, then you see some additional space has been created here to accommodate for that bigger gap. And so the entire grid has become a bit bigger, and now here we have more space. Okay, and that is the very, very fundamentals of CSS GRID. And I'm sure you can already start seeing the great power of this layout technology. So with just these 5 properties, we created this really complex layout. So even though it doesn't maybe look so complex, it actually is. And back in the day, before Flexbox and CSS GRID, this would have been really a lot more difficult to achieve. So CSS GRID is really powerful, and this is just the surface. And until the rest of this section, we will explore a little bit more about everything we can do with it. Now that you know some of the fundamentals of CSS GRID in practice, let's now also learn some theory about it. And so just like with Flexbox, the first question that we ask is what actually is CSS GRID? And at the most basic level, CSS GRID is a set of CSS properties that web developers can use to build 2-dimensional layouts. And when CSS GRID was first developed and brought into browsers a couple of years ago, the main idea behind it was that now we could divide a container element into rows and columns that we could then fill with its child elements. And a lot of stuff is possible here. So things like spanning elements across multiple rows and columns, overlap different elements, and more. So we use CSS GRID in 2-dimensional contexts, where it allows us to write a lot less nested HTML and also easier to read CSS. And you will start appreciating these characteristics of CSS Grid once you actually start using it and maybe comparing it to things like Flexbox or even float layouts. So CSS Grid completely changes the way that we envision and build two-dimensional layouts with CSS. And therefore, we can say that, in a way, CSS Grid completely revolutionized CSS. Now, one common misconception that many beginners have is that CSS Grid is meant to replace Flexbox. However, that is really not the case. So instead, Flexbox and CSS Grid work together perfectly. You simply use them in different situations. So when you need a one-dimensional layout, then you can simply reach for Flexbox. But if you need a two-dimensional layout, which is usually a grid anyway, then you can use CSS Grid for that. So again, one does not replace the other, but instead they work together really nicely. And now we need to once again talk about some terminology here so that when I talk about CSS Grid, we are all on the same page here. So as we just learned already, actually, the grid container is basically where everything happens, and we create a grid container by setting its display property to grid. Then all the child elements of the grid container will be the grid items. So again, just like we learned before, and also this is quite similar to Flexbox, right? Then also like Flexbox, we also have axes here. So we have a row axis and a column axis. Now, unlike Flexbox, we cannot change the direction of the row and the column axis, which in my opinion actually makes it even a bit easier to work with CSS Grid. All right, so this is the basic terminology about CSS Grid. However, since two-dimensional layouts are a bit more complex, we need actually some more terminology in order to really understand what's going on. So let's look at some more terminology here. So this is what we just saw before, but now let's also introduce the concept of grid lines, which are these lines which basically divide up the grid and separate the columns and the rows. And as you can see, these grid lines are numbered from 1 to the number of columns plus 1 and the number of rows plus 1. So if we have 3 columns, then we have 4 grid lines for the columns, and if we have 2 rows, then we have 3 grid lines for the rows. And these numbers are actually important because we can use them to place a grid item exactly in one place in the grid where we want it to be. Now, the intersection of all these grid lines, so both the grid lines for the columns and the rows, then creates all these areas into which we can place our grid items. And these areas are called the grid cells. Okay, so grid cells are always created, but they don't always need to be filled. So in this case, we only have 5 grid items, but there's still 6 cells, simply because this is a grid with 3 columns and 2 rows. And so 3 times 2 makes 6. So again, each of these spaces is called a grid cell, but they don't always need to be filled by a grid item, and also they don't need to be filled entirely. Next up, as we saw in the last lecture, we can actually create spaces between the grid items, and these are then called gutters or gaps. So remember, for that we use the gap property or also the row gap and column gap property. So technically, these are actually called gutters, okay? Finally, another term that is commonly used when we talk about CSS Grid is the term of grid track. So a grid track can be a row or also a column. So each of these are grid tracks, and so in this example here, we have 2 row tracks and 3 column tracks, okay? And we call these tracks because these concepts are a bit more about the space itself and not about the grid items. So a little bit like a grid cell, right? So remember, a grid cell might be filled by a grid item or not, but what matters is that there is some theoretical space. And the same applies to the grid track. Okay, but now I promise that's it about terminology. And I know that this is a lot to take in, so please don't worry too much about all these terms at this point. So with time, this will come naturally to you, especially things like grid cell, the grid lines, and the gutters or gaps. So these are important terms that we're going to use all the time, and so at some point you will naturally know about these. And now to finish, just like in the Flexbox lecture, let's now take a look at an overview of some of the properties that we can use on the grid container and on the grid item. And starting with the properties for the grid container, the most important ones are the grid template rows, grid template columns, the column gap and row gap, which together make up the gap property, and then also justify items and align items, which we can use to align the items inside rows or inside columns. So in other words, horizontally and vertically. So just like before, I have the default value for each of the properties and a short description. So I think it would be very helpful for you if you could print out this overview kind of as a cheat sheet so you can have it handy whenever you start writing your own CSS grid code. So I will not go over all of these here now one by one, because of course we will do that in practice. But anyway, there are also two less important properties on the grid container, which are justify content and align content. So these only apply if the container is actually larger than the grid. And so these are usually not that important. And by the way, actually this overview of the CSS grid properties does not contain all of them. So there is actually a huge amount of CSS grid properties, but we will not talk about all of them here in this course, because that would just be too confusing for beginners. This course should be comfortable for you as a CSS beginner, and therefore we are not going to overcomplicate things too much. All right. So anyway, now about the grid items, there is the grid column and the grid row properties, which are very important to place grid items into a specific cell. Then finally, we have justify self and align self, which hopefully you can recognize from Flexbox. So align self is used to override align items, and justify self is used to override justify items for one individual grid cell. So again, just like in Flexbox. So this is an overview of the most important CSS grid properties that we're going to use in this course. So make sure to print this out and have it next to your keyboard once we start writing code in the next lecture. Welcome back after that hopefully helpful theory lecture. So now let's keep talking about creating and sizing grid columns and grid rows. So in our very first lecture about CSS Grid, we already learned how to create columns and rows like this, right? Now, for me, actually most of the magic of CSS Grid comes from a very new unit, which is the FR unit. So using the FR unit here instead of pixels will allow us to very easily create flexible columns and flexible rows. So again, using pixels allows us to only give these tracks very rigid dimensions. So these here are always 200 pixels no matter what. So if I resize this like this or like this, the size always stays the same here of these columns, right? So at some point it even overflowed the container, right? And so many times that is not what we need. And instead, we want flexible columns and rows. And so, as I said in the beginning, for that we can use the new FR unit. So let's say, for example, that we want this last column here to always fill up all the remaining space. Or maybe let's say this column. All right. Let's just decrease this spacing a little bit so we can see it better. Maybe this one as well. Okay. So clearly here we have this empty space that is waiting to be filled. And so let's fill that very easily with this third column in this case. So the third column is this one, right? And so here, instead of specifying a fixed pixel value, let's specify 1 FR, which stands for fractional or just fraction. And if I give it a save now, then you see that this column has been expanded in order to fill all the available empty space. So it's a little bit like setting flex to 1 in Flexbox, right? And so now, as we adjust the size here of the window, then you see that it always keeps expanding to fit all the available space. So now here it's getting really small, and so at a certain point, it still needs to fit the content, and so therefore, then our grid will again overflow. But at all these other width, then this column here will attempt to fill all the remaining space. Okay, let's try the same with this one. So we can also set this one to the same value. So also 1 FR. And so if we do that, then what do you think will happen to these two columns? And that's right, they are now the exact same size because they have the exact same value here for the FR unit. All right, and so again, they are now the same size, and if we resize, then both of them are trying to fill the remaining empty space. And they do that basically in the same proportion because they both have the same value here. All right, and I will show you in a second what happens when we give them here different values. All right. But for now, I actually want you to think about how we can create a grid where all the columns are the same width. So I want you to pause the video here and create a grid where all 4 columns have the same width. Then you can do the same for 2 columns and for 3 columns. All right. So experiment a little bit with that, and I see you back here in a minute. All right. So hopefully you spent a minute doing that. And here I will now actually copy this and then turn this one off, just so we keep this code here. But now, hopefully you arrived at the solution that if we want 4 colors with the same width, we need to set all of these here to 1 FR. So 1 FR, all of them. And so now, no matter what, they will always have the same size. Right? So this is very powerful and very useful, and we do this kind of thing all the time. And if we remove one of them, then we will end up only with 3 columns, but they still have all the same size. So they all try to fill up the available space and all in the same proportion. And the same, of course, for just 2 columns. But let's put it back to 4 columns like this. So let's quickly review what's happening here. So in this grid container, there is basically initially all of this empty space here. So all the way from this side to this side. And then as we use the FR unit here like this, then all of that empty space will get divided up equally between these 4 columns. And that is because each of them has the same value here. So each of them is 1. But now let's see what happened if we changed one of them to 2, for example. So let's see. And now this one here gets double the space than all the other columns. So now the space basically is divided into 5 fractions. So 2 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 5 fractions. And so out of these 5 fractions, the first column gets 2 of them, and the remaining ones get each of them each. And the same is true as we keep increasing the size here, let's say 3, then this should now have half of the space. And to see this in reality, let's make this a bit bigger. Right. And let's inspect this also, just so we see that this is true. So this grid now has a width of 1096. So let's make it a bit smaller. So I want to make it 1000 pixels to make it easier to understand. And that's close enough. And so this one here gets approximately 500 pixels, which is half. And then these other columns here have a lot less. So that's basically a sixth of the available space. And I know that this one here is half because now we have 6 units. So 3 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 6. And the first one gets 3, which is half, right? So this is very important stuff and very helpful. And just like in Flexbox, this allows us to not having to specify width manually. Okay, now going back here to equal sized columns, I actually want to show you something else. So here we can also specify the auto keyword instead of one of these units. So if we say auto, for example, on the 4th column, then it will only take exactly the size that is necessary to fill its content. And many times in practice, this is actually exactly what we need for one of the columns. So this one here is important to keep in mind. Okay, but let's once again turn this off, because now I want to even show you something else again. So let's write grid template columns again, because there is actually an easier way of writing 4 times fr like we did here. So instead, CSS GRID introduced a repeat function where we can simply write repeat, then open parentheses, and then write how many columns you want and how large they should be. So let's say 1 fr, and there we go. So this is equivalent to just writing 1 fr 4 times. And so one more time, CSS GRID is making our life a lot easier. Let's remove this here. And of course, this could just be 3. And then we would get another row here. And this row, by the way, is called an implicit row, while these two here are called explicit rows. And that's because these first 2 rows, we actually did specify some sizes for them, right? And so we explicitly defined these 2 rows, while this third one here was basically just added automatically because we run out of space in the grid that we defined. And so this row here that was added automatically is called an implicit row. And in fact, we do have a way of styling implicit rows, but that is outside the scope of this course. So usually we just always define an explicit grid like we did here. So by using these 2 properties. So let's set it back to 4. And now let's move on quickly to rows, because the fr unit is actually also available on rows. So let's try that. And in order to do this, we actually first need to give the container a height, because otherwise there's not really anything to fill, right? So let me show that to you. And I will move that up here again with the Option or Alt up key. Let's put that here. And grid template rows. And so as I was saying, if we just do this, because then there's no space to fill, but actually there is some space. So these rows are quite tall, but let me explain you why that is happening. So just like before, we have this one element which is 150 pixels tall, right? And so therefore, this entire row here will then be 150 pixels tall as well. And so therefore, that is then 1 fr, all right? So again, the height of this track, this row track here, is defined by its tallest element, which is this one here with 150 pixels. And so therefore, then the entire height of this row is 1 fr as we defined it here. And so then the second track gets the exact same height because, well, that has also 1 fr. But let's then now actually remove this here. And so this was the result I was expecting in the beginning. Okay, so now these are still the same size because they are still 1 fr, but the size is now defined by this row because this here is the height that is necessary to create this row. But now, as I was saying, let's actually define a height for this container. So if we say like 600 pixels, then you see that it looks very different. Let's make it a bit smaller. And yeah, so by creating a height for this container, we added a lot of empty space, which could now be filled by these two fractional units, right? And just like before, we could of course make this one taller, like double as tall, by giving it double diffractions. Okay, let's put it back. And usually the FR unit is actually more helpful on columns. Okay, so in fact, in many situations, it's actually enough to only define columns and let the rows be filled automatically. Now, just one final thing is that, of course, the auto keyword is also available for rows. So now this only takes the space it needs, and all the remaining space is automatically filled up by this one here, so by this first row track, which has the fractional unit. All right, and with this, you actually already learned many of the most important fundamentals of CSS Grid. So with this, we can already create some pretty useful grids in the real world. However, let's actually take it one step further in the next lecture and learn how to actually manually place and span grid items inside of our grid container. So until now, we have basically let CSS Grid decide where to place our items in a completely automatic way, simply following the source HTML code. However, sometimes it's important to manually place elements in a grid cell other than the predefined one. And so let's now learn how. And let's start by turning this one here off, set this here back to 1 fr, and actually let's turn this height back on. So this makes it look a little bit better. And also here I will increase the gap because that will make it easier to visualize what we are going to do now. Okay, but now let's go to the topic of this video, which is about how to place a certain grid item, like this one here say, into another grid cell, like here for example. So into a grid cell that was not its default one. All right. And going back to that terminology of grid cells and all that, let me actually show you the very helpful dev tools that we have for CSS grids. So here you can actually see many of the terms that I mentioned before in the theory lecture. So you have the numbered grid lines, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have the gutters, and you also can see the grid cells. Well, let me turn one of them off, like this one here. So to turn this on, we need to actually click this here. And so here you can see that basically the intersection of these two grid lines here creates this cell. So right now this cell does not have any grid item, and that is perfectly okay. Then here you have the so-called gutters, which we can create with the gap. And yeah, so these are then the tracks, so the row tracks and the 4 column tracks like this, right? But now we are actually interested in these numbered grid lines here because they will allow us to place any grid item wherever we want. So let me show you how, and for that I'm leaving it turned on here. So let's actually use that example I mentioned in the beginning. So placing this grid item here inside of this grid cell. So basically in this position here. So let's select it. It is element 8. So the class is this one, L8. And we want it placed here. And so that is column number 2 as visible from this grid line, and row number 1 as visible from this grid line. So let's start actually with the column. So we can say grid column, and then, as I said, that's column number 2, and then we can also specify the end, basically. So we say that it should start at column number 2 and end at column number 3. So right here. So if I save this now, then you see that it did actually move to the second column. Now this created then an additional row here, but let's fix that now by moving it here to row number 1. So again, turning these on, now to grid row number 1, 2, 2, right? And keep in mind that these two are properties that always need to be used on grid items, right? So these here, like grid template columns, rows, and gap, are used on the grid container, while these are used on grid items. But anyway, let's put it here exactly where we want it. And there you go. Now it is right here, exactly where we placed it. And now let's do the same with this one here. And I want to place it down here. So let me select it first. So that's element 2. And now I want you to pause the video and write the code to, again, place this item exactly in this cell. So do you think you can do that? Hopefully you can, and I see you here in a minute once you are ready. Okay, so let's once again turn on the visualization here, and then let's write our code. So that is grid column 1 to 2, right? So it should start here and go here. And then as for the row, it should go from 2 to 3. So grid row 2 to 3. And there it is. Beautiful. And actually, if the second value here is just one more than the first, we can omit it. So we can do this, and it will still be in the same place. However, what do you think will happen when we specify a second value that is actually not just +1? So we had this, but what if we did this? So what do you think it is going to look like now? So let's save that. And, well, now this item spans across 2 cells. So let's again bring back. And so, yeah, this is exactly what we specified. So column 1, 2, 3. And so therefore, now it fills these 2 cells here. And so this is the trick that we use in order to have an item span across multiple grid cells. And of course, we could use any other number here, like 4, right? And so now it spans across these 3 cells. And notice how I just said 3 cells, right? So sometimes we might not want to do math here. And so instead of this, we can actually also say span 3. So in other words, instead of specifying the final value of the grid line, we can simply say start at 1 and then span across 3 cells. And so this should now look exactly the same, and it does. So let me keep that other one here as well. So as a reference, basically. but these two are exactly the same. All right, and if we say span 2, well then, as you can expect, it will only span across 2 cells, and then like this, which is quite unnecessary, but just to see it, now we are back to filling only 1 cell. Now, of course, we can also say span 4, and then it will go all the way from one side to the container of the other one. And let's actually keep working with this situation where we want one grid item to span all the way to the end of the container. So in some situations, we might not even know how many columns there are in a grid, or we might simply not want to think about how many cells we need to span. And so in those situations, there is a very nice trick that we can use instead of manually spanning. So let me again just copy this and turning it off to keep it as a reference. All right. And so if we simply want one element to span all the way to the end, we can use -1. So you see the result is the same. And this still works, of course. For example, if we started this at 2, so then it would start at 2 and it would span all the way to the end, which is -1. And now let me quickly show you why this trick works, which is actually a really great trick, a really great idea. So you see that these grid lines go from 1 to 3 to 5 here at the top of the grid. However, at the bottom of the grid, if you see it, then they go from -1 to -5. So basically in the opposite direction. So what this means is that each of these grid lines actually has 2 numbers. So this one is not only 4, but also -2. And so this one, which is the last one, is not only 5, but it is also -1. And so this is why the trick works. So we start at 1, which is here. So this grid line is called 1 and -5. And so we can just use this one. So 1. And then we go all the way to -1, which again is this last one here. And so this is why this trick works. Okay, and finally, of course, the same thing. So spanning also works for rows. So let's experiment maybe with this number 6 here now. So L6, and let's leave the column where it is. So of course we can, if we want, only manipulate one of them. And so let's say grid row. So right now it is at 3, but let's say we want it to go until 6. Well, that's not what I intended. So I think I said 3, not 4. So yeah, this is what I was looking for. So this doesn't look very special, but actually what happened was that a new row here was inserted. Let's just do this until 4. Okay, so now you see that a new row was inserted. So 3, then here for some reason we're missing the 4, but then there is 5 all the way at the end. So this is maybe not such a good example, but we can just experiment a little bit more with this. So if we just briefly turn off this one here, then we have some more space so that we can span this one here. So this number 8, we already have it selected. And so if we say, for example, 3 here, then as expected, it will span these 2 grid cells now across these 2 rows. And the same works if we say -1, then it goes all the way to the end. Or if we say span 2. Now, if we said span 3, then it would create just another row down here. So just like we saw it actually happening before. Okay. But let's actually turn it off again. I will again just leave it here as a reference. Let's turn this one back on because I liked the way that looked. And yeah, So I think I showed you enough now about this topic, but this is worth experimenting a lot with. So I hope that you have some time to maybe do that now. So you can select different elements here and then see what happens when you place them in different cells and do some spanning. And you can even try to overlap them. So basically placing different grid items in the same cell. And you will see that that actually works. So have some fun with that, and then I will see you back here for our next lecture. Now, just like in Flexbox, in CSS GRID, we also have the ability of aligning grid items. And so let's now learn how that works. And now let's actually work on this other grid here. So this container 2. So I'm removing display none from this one. And actually, let's put it here. Okay, now this didn't have any effect because later here we override display with the grid value, right? So not here, but let's put it here at the end. Let's say this is only temporary because of course you will want to take a look at it later. So this is our other grid container. So number 2, let's just make it a little bit smaller. Let's say just 700 pixels and a margin of 40. And so that fits our page here a little bit better. Let's quickly also create a grid. And with this we can practice a little bit. So remember, a grid container needs display set to grid. Then here we have 6 elements. For some reason we don't have number 2, but well, that doesn't matter. So we have 6 elements, so let's create a grid 3 by 2. So 3 columns, 2 rows. So grid template columns, and let's make the first 125 pixels, 200, and then another smaller one. And here I'm not using FR units because I'm not really trying to make like a real world grid. So this is just for demonstration purposes anyway. So we can just use fixed width. So template rows, and here 250, let's say, and 100 pixels. Okay, so that is our grid. All right. Once again, this number 3 here has the height of 150 pixels, and therefore it doesn't fill up the entire track height of 250 pixels. That's why we have this black color here, which is the background of this container. And you see that there is also a lot of empty space here around this grid, and so this is what we will now talk about. So, aligning grid items is a little bit different than it is in Flexbox, because we can align both the tracks inside the container, and we can also align the grid items inside of the tracks. And that's because sometimes the grid items are smaller than the cells that they are in. But let's now start with aligning the grid tracks inside of the grid container. So basically the columns and the rows inside the grid container. And that's only possible in this case because the grid itself, so this one here, is smaller than the grid container. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of empty space here. And so there is some space to align our tracks inside of the container. So let's write that here as a comment. Aligning tracks inside container. And so these are basically about distributing empty space. So empty space, just so you get this here as a very important comment. So that's distribute here. And so the properties we use for that are justified content and align content. So it's these two properties that end in content, which are for aligning tracks inside a container. And let's start with actually justify content, which you might notice is exactly the same as it is in Flexbox. and it does do the same thing. So if we set this to center, then this will align the entire tracks inside of the container. So you see, that's exactly what happened. And it is also the same thing that happens in Flexbox. So this property here might already be clear to you. Now we can also do like the other values. So we can also say space between, for example, which might be helpful. And so just like in Flexbox, maybe you expected this result where it distributed the empty space here evenly between all of these three tracks. All right, but let's turn this one off and leave it at the center like this. And so we can align them horizontally inside of the container, but of course we can also align the tracks vertically. And so for that we have align, but now it's not items, but content. So align content, which is a new one. And here, let's again use center, for example. And there we go. So with this, the entire grid is now centered inside of the grid container. We can, of course, also give ourselves some gap here. Let's say 50. And this maybe demonstrates it even a bit better. And of course, there would also be like space between, like this. So it would push each of the tracks to one of the extremes. So the first one to the top, the other one to the end. And then there's also things like start or end. And these are actually different from Flexbox. So you see here actually this suggestion which says flex end. But this one only works on Flexbox. So this is a bit confusing and I'm not sure why they did it like this. But well, in CSS GRID it's called end and start, while in Flexbox it is called flex end and flex start. All right, so again start, but let's put it at the center. So centering things in CSS is something that we usually like to do a lot. Okay, and that's it about aligning tracks inside of the container. And once again, this only makes sense because the grid container is actually bigger than the grid itself. So the grid itself is only the sum of these width of these columns plus the gap, but then the container has this higher width. Okay, and so now let's move on to aligning the tracks, or actually aligning the items inside cells. And so we can also say that these properties are about moving items around inside the cells. And let's start with align items. And this one you already remember from Flexbox, right? So what do you think is going to happen when we also set this one to center? And keep in mind that this is about aligning items inside of the cells. So right now, the cell is this entire thing here, which has this background color, so which is visible. And that's basically because by default, align items is set to stretch. So just like in Flexbox. Okay, so again, all of this here is the cell, but now we will move the items around inside of the cells. So if we set this to center, then let's see, and there you go. So now the grid items are centered vertically, because that is what align is always all about, right? And we can of course also do the same thing horizontally, and so for that it is always justify. So justify items, and if we set that to center as well, then we should only see a tiny square like around the content, but everything centered, right? And yeah, that's the result. And this will be even better to see once we turn on the grid visualization. So like this. And so, well, somehow it disappears. But anyway, so here you have the cells, And then you see that the items are in fact now aligned vertically and horizontally in the center. So let's experiment a little bit more here. And I'm doing it here now so that the overlay here doesn't disappear. So align items is by default, as I mentioned, stretch. Right? And so that would look like this. But we just set it to center, right? But then, as always, there is also start, which put them at the start, and there is end, and again, it is just end without the flex. All right. And of course, we can try the same with justify items, which also by default is stretch. So just like this, stretching all the way from left to right, because justify is horizontally. So it's across the row axis. And here we could say end as well, which would put the elements into this very corner of the cell, right? But let's actually keep them here in the center like this. So to recap, the content properties, so these two properties that end in content, they are about aligning tracks inside of the container. Okay, and then justify is horizontally, so on the row axis, while align is vertically, so on the column axis. And the same is true down here for aligning the items inside of the cells. But then these two are called items. So it is both align and justify the items. Okay. And now, finally, remember how in Flexbox we could override these individually. So let's do the same here and select, for example, element number 3, which is this one that has the special height. And so just like in Flexbox, we have align self, which will then override the align items property that we have up here. So it's in the center. Let's put it at the end, for example. So just like this. And in CSS GRID, we can then also override the justify items, so horizontally. So justify self, and then let's say end, again, just to put it there in the corner. Okay, and this is actually a very good way of centering individual items in CSS GRID. So for example, let's say that these two would actually be in the end. So all of them would be in the bottom right corner of the cell, but then we wanted to center one of them. So set this one to center, and there you go. All right, great. With this, we wrap up this introduction to CSS GRID, which I hope was not all too confusing, even though I know it was a lot to take in. But as always, there is no need to memorize all of this for now. What I want you to take away from these last few lectures was that you now know how CSS GRID actually works in broad terms, because if you know that, then it will be very easy to simply go and look up the exact properties that you need, for example, in the cheat sheet that I gave you in the theory lecture. So the one that you hopefully printed out and have somewhere on your desk, like I actually do. Nice. So that's great progress. Very good to still see you here. And now in the next video, we will apply our knowledge to the page that we have been building. So basically, we will now build our layout using CSS GRID. So I'm very excited for that one, and I hope that you are too. In this lecture, we will use many of the things that we just learned about CSS GRID and use it in order to build our blog post layout. So we are done with this part. So let's go back here. So back basically to this home URL. And so this is the layout that we built before with Flexbox, right? So let's give ourselves some space so we actually see it. And so now we want to reproduce the exact same thing one more time, but this time using CSS GRID. So we no longer need this. Then down here, there is a lot of code that we wrote using Flexbox. And actually, many of this we do want to keep. So we used Flexbox, for example, here on the author, here in the navigation, and also here in these related posts. And so there, in these very small component layouts, basically, we want to keep using Flexbox. So as I mentioned before, CSS GRID works perfectly together with Flexbox. And so again, for these small component layouts, we will keep using Flexbox if they are simply one-dimensional layouts like this clearly, and this one here, so it's just a row, and here the same. It is just like one row. And so that's one-dimensional, and so Flexbox is perfect for that. Now, on the other hand, the overall page layout is clearly two-dimensional. And so for that, we can now use CSS GRID. So looking at our page here once again, what are the parts of our layout? Well, we start with the big overall header here. Then we have this article element, then this aside element, which is on the right side of the article. And finally, on the bottom, we have this footer, which should go all the way from the left to the right side. So we will now use CSS GRID to lay out all of that. Now before, when we used Flexbox, we actually only used it on a new row element that we created here, which contains this article and this aside. Remember? So we created a div with the class of row and put these two elements in there, and then we used Flexbox to put them side by side. But now, since we can do a two-dimensional layout with CSS GRID, we no longer need that. And so the first thing that we're going to do is to deactivate that. So let's deactivate also the code that we used for the Flexbox layout. So Flexbox layout is all this. So this code we no longer want. And actually, we cannot have one comment inside of the other. So let's remove this one here. And now as for the HTML, so this is the row element that I was talking about, which we no longer need. So let's comment it out. And here also add a comment only necessary for Flexbox. And then down there, let's also take out the closing tag. So that's, well, that's this one. So I'm not deleting them again to keep them here as a reference, but I'm just commenting them out using command or control slash. All right. So let's inspect our markup here. And so now we're back to having the header here. So our main header, the article, the aside, and the footer, all of them being simply child elements of the container. And so this container is what will be our grid container. So let's now start building our CSS GRID layout. And let's start by selecting the relevant elements, which are the container. And once again, we already selected them before, but I will do that here again so that we have the layout, in this case, nicely separated from the rest of the styles. So usually we do not do that, but here, since this is a learning project, it is a little bit different. And so we will do it the other way around. So having everything together once we build our next big project. Okay. But anyway, now we need the main header. And this is not a class, but just the element. So then the article, then the side, and finally the footer. And now, as I was saying, this container is what's going to be our grid container. Okay, but just with this, nothing is going to happen because by default, CSS Grid places its grid items into rows. So we now need to define our columns using grid, template, columns. So how many columns do we have? Well, it is just 2, right? So one for the article and one for the aside. And do you remember the size of the aside? I think it was 300 pixels. Yes, so that's what we put here. So that is going to be the second column. And then as a first column, let that simply be all the remaining space. And so for that, remember, we can use one FR. Or actually, it could be any FR here, because this is the only one. But as a default, we simply use one FR. And so if we give it a save now, then something must have changed already. And indeed, now it looks different. So this one here is the header. Then here we have the article, and then here the aside and the footer. So we do indeed have a grid with 2 columns, but our items are not exactly where we want them to be, right? And so let's go ahead and fix that. So we want the main header to not simply be this one cell, right? So not just this one cell, but instead we want it to span all the way to the end, right? So we want it to be in the first one and in the second cell as well. So if we turn this on, you can see, of course, our 2 columns. And so here, grid line 1, 2, and 3. And so to do what I just said, there are multiple ways of achieving it. So here, remember, we can use the property grid column to place this element where we want it. And then we want it to start at 1. And now we can use these grid lines here, or we can say span 2, for example. And so that works. So that's already looking actually quite perfect. Now, another way in which we could have done this, remember, would have been 1 and then /-1. And then we wouldn't have to thought about how many columns we want to span. All we had to think about is that we want to go from the beginning all the way to the end. And so that's usually the way that we do it. Now the same thing for the footer, which is similar in that regard. Let's just give it some background color so we can nicely see it. And the color doesn't matter for now. So we see that the footer is just like the header previously, of course, only in one grid cell by default. But we want it to go all the way here to the right side. So we just do the exact same thing as before. So grid column and 1/-1. And now, so now indeed it stretches all the way to the end there. So let's get rid of this. And actually right now it looks almost ready already, right? We are just missing this gap here in the middle, which, remember, used to be 75 pixels. So yeah, let's do that on the container. So that is the column gap. So column gap 75 pixels. And well, there we go. So the article is back to being 825 pixels wide, just as we specified in the very beginning in our very first float layout, right? But now we don't have to specify any of these width, because CSS Grid simply figures that out automatically for us. Now the aside is of course also 300, and so everything together makes up our 1200 pixel container. Great. So this is basically almost ready, but we can actually do better. So usually what we want to do is to concentrate all the styles that are about the grid in the grid container. And that should include spacing. Now we already did that for the horizontal space. So for this space here, by using the column gap property. But the rest of the space here, so this vertical space, actually comes from margins. So there's a margin right here, and there's also some margin, here on the article. So again, we should actually concentrate these spacings all on the grid container, because that makes our code a lot easier to understand when we analyze it later. All right. So again, notice that this here has a margin bottom of 60 and the same for the header. So this main header, somewhere here, it says that the margin bottom is 60. And so let's remove all of that. So we want no margin bottom on the elements. And actually, let's not write that here, but let's really remove that extra margin, because this layout with CSS Grid will actually be our final layout. So let's look for those 60 pixels. It should be at the very top, I think. Yeah, so here we have it in the article. So let's comment that out, and here in the main header as well. And so that is confusing, especially if the layout was a lot bigger. So the space is now gone, but we can easily bring it back with just one line of CSS, which is row gap of 60 pixels. And there you go. Now you have the space here, and it's nicely visible also in this grid overlay. And so doing it like this is a lot cleaner and really a lot better for maintaining your code in the long run. Okay, and now just to finish, this aside element here is now back to stretching itself all the way to the bottom. So let's say that we don't want that, and that we want this element only here at the top. So how do we do that? So basically, how do we rearrange this element inside of the grid cell? Well, for that, we use one of the items property. So justify items or align items, right? Remember that? So in the case of vertical space, we use align items, right? So again, let's come to our grid container. And in case that this is confusing, you can just review the last lecture, I think, or also the cheat sheet where I have listed all the CSS Grid properties. So align items is, remember, used to align the grid element, so the grid item, inside of its cell. So for example, remember, one of the popular options is to set it to center. And here it's actually align items. And so now this one here moved to the center. All right. And this first one here didn't change anything because this element is actually the one that dictates the size of this row, right? So if you notice, we actually did not define any grid template rows, right? So basically, we are simply allowing CSS Grid to adjust the rows to its content, okay? And so that's why I actually said earlier that it's pretty common to only define columns and not rows, because many times the rows are simply defined by whatever content they contain. So again, in this case, it is this piece of content here which dictates the size of this entire row. And so if we center the grid items then vertically, of course, this one here is not going to move anywhere. But this one is, and so let's now push it to the start. And remember, that is just start, not flex start, like it is in Flexbox. Okay, there you go. And actually, that's it. So this is the third way of building the exact same layout And if you ask me, this is actually the very best way of doing so. But now I'm pretty sure that you need to practice these skills a little bit more, and so you can do that right in the next lecture in the final coding challenge of this section. So to wrap up this section, here is coding challenge number 3. And I hope you're not yet tired of this example, because we will work with it one more time here. So in the last challenge, you built this layout here using Flexbox. And so as you might have guessed, now it's time to build the exact same layout using CSS GRID. Okay. Now, when we built this with Flexbox, we wrapped these 3 columns here, so these 3 elements, into one container element. And we then used Flexbox only on that. So a little bit like we also did in our blog post project, right? But now I actually want you to go ahead and remove that container div and basically use all of this, so the entire element here, as the Flex container, okay? Now, another important hint that I need to give you as you start designing your grid is that this here is going to be the first column, so this image, right? And so remember that this one here has a fixed width of 250 pixels, and so probably you should adjust your column to that. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And yeah, that's actually all you need to do for this challenge. So the minor stuff that we did before with Flexbox, and what I mean is this here and the colors, so that I want you to leave intact. So keep using Flexbox for that, and use CSS GRID only for the overall layout here, which is actually 2-dimensional. And so CSS GRID is a good fit for that. So as always, take all the time that you need, and then meet me back here once you are done. All right, and I am 100% sure that was fun for you. So as I said, let's start by removing this container here, together with its closing tag, of course. Then let's go up here and remove all the traces of a Flexbox in this layout. And actually, let's also get rid of this stupid clearfix class. So here we have our container, which right now is set to display flex. So let's change that to display grid, like this. And then we also need to specify, of course, our columns. So grid, template, columns. And then remember what I said about our first column. So the first column, we want this image here to be, which has a width of 250. So it's basically a fixed width that we want to maintain. And so let's make our first column also exactly 250 pixels. And then the other 2 columns, we want them both to occupy the exact same space, and they should also fill up all the remaining space. And so therefore we give both of them the width of 1 FR. And so with this, let's wait for it. Well, that didn't really do anything. Oh, and of course, because we just removed the container class, and so this code should actually be on the product itself. So where is that? Yeah, right here. So let's see. Beautiful. That looks a lot better. Well, it's far from being perfect, but it's something, right? So let's get rid of this container code, which made us do this small mistake. And now let's think about this title here, and also about the button, which are not one of these 3 columns, right? So what we want to happen to them is that they should stretch all the way from the start to the end, right? So that title is exactly this one, so product title. And so here we say grid column 1 to -1. So that's a trick that hopefully you know by now. And so let's actually copy it and use the same thing on the button. So this one should do the exact same thing, right? So button, let's add that there, and beautiful. Now here we still have some gaps that we do not want, and that's because we simply maintained the gap property that we had before from Flexbox, but instead it is now column gap. And actually we're already done. So that was a bit too easy, maybe. So basically the main trick here, in order to remain this width, was simply to give this column the exact same size as the image. So as we already had done before here. And then everything else simply happened automatically. So this row here basically also has the height of 250 pixels because that is the height of the biggest content here. So this image, right? And just to quickly inspect that, so I always like to use this grid overlay because it makes it so clear what exactly is happening. And so yeah, again, we can see here that this entire row, so all the elements here do have a width of, or actually a height of 250. And this one does not, but that's simply because there is not enough content in there. But anyway, with this, we actually now finished the topic of CSS Grid and also this entire big section on building layouts with CSS. So this was quite a fundamental and important section that sets the stage for the rest of the course. And so I should warn you once again that in order to advance to the rest of the course now, you should make sure that you really understand this material quite well. So it doesn't need to be perfect. You don't need to know all the properties by heart, again, but you should at least understand how these technologies that we learned work and a little bit about how you can use them. So take all the time that you need in order to practice as much as you can, and only then let's move on together to our next section, which is actually one of the most exciting one, I think at least, in this entire course. So we're going to talk about web design and learn a lot of different rules and guidelines, and we will actually also apply them immediately to a new project. So it's time to say goodbye to our blog post project here, because in the next section we will start a new one. But anyway, enough talk, and I see you soon in that next section.